Do you like the look of these tree blocks, but you're not sure how to assemble them? Or maybe you're looking for some tips for making perfect triangles. In this video, you'll learn some different techniques for making the triangles that can be used to assemble this tree. You'll also discover how to use paper piecing when dealing with these irregular shapes. You'll find this supply list below, along with links to the other handouts. If you're new to this seasonal sampler series, directions for the 3 maple leaf blocks can also be found in the links below. First, let's look at this 12-inch tree. There are 3 squares down the center. Each square's finished size is 2 inches. Add 1/2 inch to account for seam allowances, and you'll cut 3 2.5-inch squares. These 2 triangles make a square and are called half-square triangles, or HSTs. This tree has 24 sets of half-square triangles. Actually 23 because I substituted a square in here. If you use 3 to 4 different fabrics for the leaves in the tree, then you'll need about 6 to 8 triangles of each in order to distribute them throughout the tree. You could cut out single triangles and then sew them together, but you can save time by choosing a method that produces multiple triangles at once. Here's a quick way to get 8 perfect sets of half-square triangles. Start with the finished size, which is 2 inches. Add 1 inch, and you come up with 3 inches. Then multiply that by 2, and that's the size you'll cut your square. Actually, I like to cut 2 squares at once with right sides together. On the back of the fabric, mark lines through the centers. Next, draw in the diagonals. Sew 1/4 inch over from the diagonal on both sides. Cut on the center lines and then on the diagonals. You'll get 8 sets of triangles. After pressing to the dark, you'll square up to 2.5 inches and then trim the excess. This is your chance to cut 2 perfect triangles in a square. If possible, use the 45-degree line on your mat. I've placed the 45-degree line on my ruler over the diagonal on my square. I've checked to make sure that there's a little extra fabric past this 2.5 mark on the side and on the bottom, and I'm ready to trim. Take your square and line up your square on that 45-degree line and on your mat horizontal and vertical line. Line up the diagonal on your ruler and on your square. Find the 2.5 mark, trim. It's important that you have a 2.5-inch square, but it's also important that this diagonal line goes through this corner and this corner. If you'd like to make less than 8 triangles, you can still use this method. Cut a 3-inch by 6-inch rectangle. Mark the center and the diagonals. Sew over 1/4 inch. You'll end up with 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of triangles. Paper piecing these triangles in strips is another option. This technique is very easy and extremely accurate for a strip of triangles, but it's more difficult when you go to sew the rows together. I suggest you try making at least 1 strip to see if you like this technique. Cut out your pattern. Doesn't have to be perfect, but make sure you don't cut off that dashed line. Fold your pattern on these sew lines. Cut 3.5-inch to 4-inch strips or scraps of fabric. Your number 1 fabric will be the background fabric. Cut off about 3.5 to 4 inches. This fabric will be positioned here on the back of the paper. I'll turn this over and put number 1 fabric, and you'll want the right side facing you. On this fabric, it doesn't make any difference. And then pin. Your fabric needs to go at least to that dashed line. Fold on this line, and then I'll trim that excess fabric. I'd like to eyeball about 1/4 inch seam. Look for my number 2 fabric. It's going to go right there, and I'll cut that down also. Once again, it doesn't have to be perfect. This piece will go right here. So I'll put right sides together, turn it over. I want to make sure that there's extra fabric out here and down here, and I'll take this to my sewing machine. I started sewing before the dashed line and I ended up past the dashed line. I'll take this over to be pressed. After pressing, I want to take and fold this back. It's okay to rip that paper. Trim. Number 3 fabric's going to go here. Let's turn it over. Going to go right there. Let's put right sides together like this and stitch. I started sewing before the dashed line and ended after the dashed line. Take this over and press. I'll continue sewing in this manner until I fill up my paper. When you're finished sewing, trim at the dashed lines. And here are 3 sets of half square triangles. This works best when all the triangles are from the same fabric. If using different fabrics, you'll want to plan out your tree beforehand. If you're interested in more detailed instructions along with this free pattern, follow the links below. When all of your triangles have been completed, lay them out using your pattern as a reference. All the leaf triangles on this side point to the center. All the leaf triangles on this side point to the center. Arrange your triangles in a pleasing design. If you have extra triangles, save them for another project. Make sure to take a photo of your final design to use as a reference when sewing these sections together. Now that we've looked at these smaller triangles, let's focus on this bigger triangle. Notice that this triangle and this triangle make up a 6-inch square. You can use the half square triangle formula to figure out the cutting size. The formula for a single half square triangle is to add 7/8 to the finished side. You'll end up with 6 7/8 inches. Normally you would cut a square that size and then cut it on the diagonal to get 2 half square triangles, but you only need 1, so we'll cut a corner. Let me show you what that looks like. You'll want to get a straight edge, then line up your ruler on the mat lines and trim. Here's your nice straight corner. Measure 6 7/8 inches, mark the spot, measure over 6 7/8 inches and mark your spot. Line up your ruler with those 2 marks and cut. You can use this pattern to double check your accuracy. This is the pattern for this bottom section of the tree. It's paper pieced as there are no quick methods for cutting out this irregular shape. I could make templates for this, but I prefer to use paper piecing whenever possible. To get started, cut out your pattern. Doesn't have to be perfect, just make sure that you don't cut through those dashed lines. Take a card or a postcard and fold on those dark lines. The fabric needs to cover the shape with a little extra all the way around. On this pattern, it's nice to have the straight of grain or cross grain on these edges. When I cut this shape, I made sure to cut it on the straight of grain and cross grain, and that covers that triangle. The same is true of this shape. I cut it on the straight of grain and cross grain a little bit bigger than this piece, and then I'll cut it through the center. Cut fabric number 1. This is where it goes. We're going to put it on the back. Cut. Make sure that at least as big as those dashed lines and pin. Pick up your pattern, fold on that line, eyeball about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and trim. Piece number 2 would go here. Let's put right sides together. Check to make sure that the fabric clears the top and clears the bottom, and stitch on this line. I started stitching before the dashed line and finished after the solid line. Then I press this piece. I folded back the paper. I trimmed about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Number 3 is my next piece. I'll pick that up. It's going to go right here. I'll take and put right sides together. Turn it over, check to make sure that there's a little extra here and extra here, and then I'll stitch that line. I stitched that line and then I pressed. Turn this over and fold this back. It's okay if you rip a little bit of the paper. And eyeball about a 1/4 inch seam. Number 4 is going to go down there. I think to make it a little bit easier, I'll cut this down to make it look more like a triangle. So let's put this over here. Put right sides together. Make sure that there's extra fabric up on top and here. And you want a little extra in the seam. Maybe I'll move this up a little bit. And I'll stitch across. I stitched on this line, pressed, and then used my rotary cutter to trim off the outside edges. When tearing off the paper, put your finger over the thread and start ripping. Finger over the thread and start ripping. If you end up with little pieces of paper, you can just leave them or use your tweezers to go in there to pull them out. Put right sides together and carefully stitch this bias edge. Add the final piece to your tree. And now you're ready to sew the sections together. In the next video, you'll get some tips for matching all those intersections. Hope you stay tuned. Thanks for visiting LearnHowToQuilt.com. Please share our free videos and patterns with your friends.